I am pleased to introduce Professor Wohlforth as our speaker tonight on the most timely issue of the moment in international relations, the crisis over Ukraine. Is there a diplomatic solution? Professor Wohlforth received his doctorate with distinction in political science in 1989. This after earning his master's in international relations and then his master's in philosophy, also at Yale. He is presently the Daniel Webster Professor of Government at Dartmouth College, having taught there since 2000. And before that, he taught at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown, and before that at Princeton. Professor Wohlforth has authored or co-authored 10 books. The most recent, a 2-volume text entitled History of International Relations and Russian Foreign Policy in the 20th Century. He has published 88 articles, the most recent in the July-August Foreign Affairs, entitled A Measure Short of War, The Return of Great Power Subversion. The titles of these journal articles range from the aftermath of the Cold War, American primacy, unipolar hegemony, and the balance of power, international security, realism in international politics, and NATO-Russian relations. How lucky we are to have him speak to us this evening.
Thank you very much. That is a wonderful introduction. I'm glad there's a recording of it. I'll share it with my mother as soon as I get it so she can see that I finally made it. Really appreciate it. And I also appreciate the invitation. And I'm going to try to keep my remarks to 30 minutes to enable the question and answer, which I think is going to be probably the most important part and most enjoyable part of the evening. But I do feel that I ought to earn my keep by putting some ideas on the table. So I'm going to share my screen, put up some slides in hopes of having a kind of common basis from which to have our conversation. Of course, I don't know my audience as well as I know my student audiences, so I don't know what you know. And so if there's things that I'm going to talk about that you already know, you can check your email or your Instagram accounts or anything during that, just as my students tend to do. So without further ado, let me share my screen and then share this presentation. Let's make sure this all works. And I'll be looking for a nod of the head or some other signal that this is actually working as we hope. I'm assuming that you're now seeing my screen. Great. Let's get this chat over here. Fabulous. So the title of the presentation is right here. And I really only have 3 things to cover. What is this crisis actually? What's going on right now? How did we get here? And can we avert war? I mean, what's the best chance we have for a peaceful diplomatic resolution of this crucial crisis? And so without further ado, I'm going to start on just sort of an intro, just sort of to get everybody on the same page as to what is actually the crisis. We see here a situation that is fundamentally representing an attempt by Russia to use its local military superiority around Ukraine to renegotiate its relations with Europe, to renegotiate its relations with the United States over the security system in Europe, and to renegotiate the Ukraine situation, the Ukraine's status between Europe and Russia. Russians, according to President Biden tonight, have deployed some 150,000 troops, a large proportion of their active troops in various positions around Ukraine. Not shown on this map is the fact there's also naval forces in the Black Sea able to access Ukraine via the land landings if they on the coast if they should wish to do so. This is a very intimidating deployment. It's clearly meant to achieve something. It's been accompanied by 3 principal demands from Russian officials. The first is an ironclad legal treaty that would commit NATO never to admit Ukraine, never ever, to use the word of the Russian deputy foreign minister. The second principal demand is another treaty separate treaty that the Russian Foreign Ministry, against normal diplomatic practice, decided to publish in its entirety, this proposed treaty, under which NATO force posture, that is the deployment of NATO forces, would be returned, wound back to the situation prior to the initial expansion of the NATO alliance in 1997. In other words, NATO would unilaterally accept a major restriction on where it could deploy forces in any of the states that joined the alliance after 1997. Related to these two demands regarding the never in NATO pledge by Ukraine and the NATO back to 1997 treaty, there is a insistence that we settle the Ukrainian situation. We settle the war in Ukraine, where you see on this map, a sector of Ukraine is controlled by Russian-backed separatists, the so-called Donbass, the Donetsk coal basin area of eastern Ukraine. That this be settled in a way consistent with the so-called Minsk Accords, which was the agreements that brought a very poorly observed ceasefire and reflected a roadmap for settling the Ukraine crisis, which Russia claims is the West and Ukraine have failed to live up to this Minsk agreement. So you've got these three pieces. The US, European, and Ukrainian response has been to reject outright, unambiguously, the first two claims that Russia has issued in connection with its military deployment. They've offered to negotiate under a diplomatic process the third issue, the settlement of the Ukrainian civil war. It's not really a civil war, the Ukrainian intervention by Russia. And the Americans have responded and the Europeans have responded with the idea of revving up an arms control dialogue to try to address some of Russia's concerns regarding the deployment of weapons close to its borders. They also have insisted, of course, that negotiations are two sides, and Russia has done no small amount of its own transgressions, according to the West, including, of course, the illegal annexation of Crimea in 2014, which you see reflected on this map. There are obviously a major Russian military forces deployed in the Crimean Peninsula, but that peninsula was seized, according to the West and Ukraine, completely illegally by Russia in 2014. So there's many other counter demands that the West has responded to Russia, asking Russia that it would have to, of course, address these in a reciprocal fashion. Now, each side of this conflict cites principles in support of its position. So it's not just a raw power politics game. It's about principles that each side brings to the conversation. The Russian side cites the principle of so-called indivisible security, which is indeed enshrined in a few European treaties, in which they claim that efforts to secure oneself should not come at the expense of making others insecure. So they claim that a Ukrainian effort to secure itself via NATO membership makes Russia insecure and therefore violates the principle of indivisible security. The West, for its part, responds with its own principles, primarily the principle of sovereignty, which says Ukraine should get to choose its own alliances. Others don't get to tell it what to do. And therefore, consistent with this claim of sovereignty, the West claims to stand against, to oppose any concept of a sphere of influence. So that's essentially the crisis. It is a crisis of coercion in which Russia is raising the specter of potential use of force in order to push forward demands. These demands have been rejected. Now, we're going to come back to the details of what's going on in the moment, but first let me look back very quickly and bring us up to date on how we got here. And I want to do so by looking at each of the three elements that are kind of in play here. The Ukraine part of the story about European security. Why is Russia making demands about how security is to be provided in Europe? And the third is this whole business about the Ukraine war and the need to settle this war and the separatist pieces of Donbass. These are sort of the three parts of the negotiations that are underway. And I'm just going to tell us a little bit about how we got here. So let's start with a little bit about Ukraine. Now, you could start way, way back to the Middle Ages and look at this medieval polity called Kievan Rus, which in some sense three different contemporary East Slavic states, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, could all claim to stem from the same polity. Now, bear in mind that after this polity was formed, the Mongol Tatar invasion occurred. And so you had essentially a quarter of a millennium in which this whole thing was wiped off the map before modern Russia emerged. We could have a long conversation about these deep historical roots. The main point of my even mentioning this slide is that this sense of a common origin gives rise to competing narratives in Russia and in Ukraine about this long storied history. Whereas in Russia, there's a tendency to emphasize the brotherly, close, fraternal, indeed, perhaps even kind of shared nationhood between Ukrainians and Russians. In Ukraine, on the contrary, there's a narrative of a Ukrainian nation constantly suppressed and repressed by various empires, notably the Russian Empire. So to my mind, these narratives can't really ever be reconciled and probably are not a mechanism towards a peaceful solution. Instead, we need to look at the more immediate background of the Ukrainian situation today and the existence of a Ukrainian state. And that is that today's Ukraine occupies this territory that was once the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And so it's emerged out of this Russian Empire and then Soviet Empire. So that's where the territory immediately comes from. And the Ukrainian state that exists today is a so-called post-Soviet state, a state that emerged out of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's the immediate situation. That's where some of the border issues come from. So what we're dealing with when we're dealing with Ukraine is we're dealing with a territory that consists of people who have lived under different kinds, or at least their ancestors lived under different kinds of empires over different periods. This slide I'm showing you now only captures a part of the vast complexity of the kinds of receding and advancing empires that at one time or another ruled over bits of Ukrainian territory. And people like to infer from this different historical background claims about the different regional identities of Ukraine, different affiliations, with the standard terminology you will see in today's press of a Western Ukraine that's far more inclined towards associating itself with the European project and the West, and in Eastern Ukraine, where there's a greater sensitivity towards wanting to be part of the Russian world or closely associated with Russia. And you've tended to see this in election results over the years, where pro-Russian parties tend to win in the West, and pro-EU and Europe and NATO parties tend to win elections more in the East. So that's kind of the background. Now, the key point to make up here about the background of Ukraine is that really for the first 20 years of existence as a state, it vacillated between East and West. Here we see a chart showing the 2010 election results for Viktor Yanukovych, who was a Russian-leaning politician, winning huge majorities in the East, and particularly in those Eastern provinces or Eastern areas of Donetsk and Luhansk, which are the now Russian-supported rebellious republics. And so that equilibrium sort of existed with Ukraine kind of navigating between East and West. So that's our Ukraine situation. The second big of the three things that are in play today is the so-called European Security Order. I could bore you all to death talking about the European Security Order, but here, most important are 3 points concerning this issue that Russia seems to care a lot about. Indeed, Russia analysts that I talk to keep saying it's not just Ukraine, it's about the European Security Order. Point one here is shown in a bunch of graphs that simply show you the colossal effects of the collapse of the Soviet Union upon Russia. This is true not just of Russia, but it's true also of Ukraine and other post-Soviet states. Essentially, the numbers you're seeing here for GDP growth overall, for the growth of the economy per person, and looking at the life expectancy stats, especially look at that blue line on your bottom right, the drop in life expectancy of men. Those are numbers you normally don't see in peacetime. Russia experienced in the 1990s a collapse akin to what happens to societies when they are at major war. And so it was at this point, when Russia was at its weakest point as a state since its own civil war in the 1920s, that the European Security Order was created. If those graphs are boring and don't really capture the sense of the time, this picture really does. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Russia in these years, and here we see these drunkards, we see the crumbling infrastructure, we see the McDonald's sign saying the world is changing, but it wasn't changing for the better for most Russians during this period. And this was precisely the period where Russia was on its back. Russia was incapable of defending itself in many ways, and this is the era in which the basic European structure was settled. And that security order, point number 2, is based on a NATO that is dominated by the United States and that excludes Russia. So we have a security system dominated by Russia's potential geopolitical enemy, the United States. And it has an open door policy under which any state that wants to get in NATO and that meets NATO's criteria can become a member of that alliance. And so we had waves of expansion, first to Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary, and then onward to all the states you see to the east of the old division between East and West Germany, all joining NATO in the 1990s. And this is something that the third point I want to make about the security order, that Russia has always objected to under every single president they've ever had, including Yeltsin, including Putin, including Medvedev. Here we see Putin in his famous Munich Security Conference speech of 2007, laying out this deep resentment against the security order. That speech caught a lot of attention, but essentially nothing happened in response to the speech. And so that then brings me to the last piece I want to talk about in terms of background to the current crisis before we get to the immediate origins of the crisis and move on to the Q&A. And that is, how did we get to the situation where we had Russia intervening quite dramatically in Ukraine and fueling a war within the state of Ukraine? If you read the news today, you'll hear Ukrainians saying, "Why are you Americans so worked up? We've been living with Russian war against us for 8 years. We've been fighting a war for 8 years." There's a couple of points to make about this, how it came to be that we ended up with this Russian intervention. The first is that we began to see much more intense competition between Russia and the West over the future, the geopolitical and the geoeconomic future of Ukraine. Essentially, Ukraine was not wanting to choose irrevocably between Russia and the West, but essentially the West and Russia, the EU and NATO on the one hand, and Russia, Putin on the other hand, were increasingly putting before Ukrainian leadership zero-sum either-or choices between East and West. And that essentially created problems for maintaining that peaceful equilibrium in Ukraine. The second key thing that happens here is that Russia begins to escalate its opposition to this European security order, which I mentioned. And the first big move in this, coming a year after that Munich speech I mentioned, was Russia's escalation in Georgia. Essentially, long story, won't get into it, but fundamentally claiming that enclaves protected by Russia within Georgia were under assault by the Georgian authorities. These authorities in Tbilisi, Georgia, were eager to join NATO and thought that NATO would have their back. This is the Russian view. And then they essentially sought to attack these little enclaves that Russia was protecting, and Russia swept in with massive force. There's a lot of lesson from this events for today, including the idea of de-escalation via ending your exercises, as the Russians announced today. Same thing happened in 2008. They were doing exercises around north of Georgia, and they said, "Oh, we're going to end the exercises." And not long after that, they invaded the country. But essentially, the point of that invasion was, you're not joining NATO. Russia created an institutional response to its challenge that it felt that it was getting from the EU by Putin created this idea of a Eurasian Union that would sort of compete with the EU. And you could see that Ukraine was in the crosshairs as a state that Putin really wanted to join his Eurasian Union. This is his way of pushing back against this ever-encroaching, he thought, Western order that he saw as a threat to Russia's security and to the stability of its regime. The EU's response, the EU's attempt to deal with the increasingly competitive environment that we're seeing in Europe, was the idea of a partnership program or a European neighborhood policy. We see here the Vilnius Summit of 2013, in which you can see those countries in yellow are former Soviet republics that the EU wanted to rope in and invite into the EU. But again, as Putin is pushing this Eurasian Union, the Europeans are saying, you know, membership in the EU is not consistent with membership in this corrupt, authoritarian Eurasian Union that Putin is trying to press. So you see these competing visions for what Ukraine should do being pressed by powerful forces on either side. Another key point that occurs during this period, aside from the that leads up to the Russian intervention in Ukraine, is an increase in Russia's relative strength. I showed you a picture of Moscow a few slides ago. This is how many Russians think of it today. This is the so-called Moscow City, a new sort of financial center arising up in Moscow. It's simply meant to capture increasing Russian capacity to act as a government and as a state, as its military was reformed, as its finances were brought under control, as it built up a gigantic sovereign wealth fund, a reserve of foreign currency it can use if anyone tries to threaten it, and all kinds of other very anti-democratic, very authoritarian measures taken in the domestic realm to crush opposition and to present Russia and to make Russia, in Putin's view, more or less invulnerable to, or at least more resilient in the face of what he sees as Western blandishments and Western pressure. So this then, this competitive environment is what then leads up to the last piece of the background that I'm giving you. I know you're eager to get to the conversation, but the last piece is necessary because at the end of the day, although the Russians want this to be a crisis over the European order, it is ultimately a crisis, as Mary said in the introduction, around Ukraine. Ukraine is at the center of this crisis. And so we need to understand sort of how Ukraine got into this situation with this gigantic Russian, or this very consequential Russian intervention already in 2014. And I'm not going to give you a detailed blow by blow of how this happened. You're seeing a picture on the slide of the Maidan protest. And I'll tell you in a minute what it was. It's what the Ukrainians call the revolution of dignity against the corrupt and at the time thought to be pro-Russian regime of Yanukovych, who was in power in 2014. What happened? Well, you had an intensification of that competition I talked about between the EU on the one hand and Russian Vladimir Putin and the Eurasian Union that he sought on the other hand. And you basically got these competing offers. And at that Vilnius summit that I mentioned in 2014, I showed you a little poster from, Yanukovych is seen here agreeing with the EU commissioner on a plan that would lead towards a membership of the European Union. It would it contained a bunch of potential benefits for Ukraine. But then Yanukovych travels to Sochi, where the Olympics are going on, and Putin offers him a huge subsidy, something in the tune of $30 billion, with, as usual for authoritarians, no strings attached, no transparency, if he would join the European Union, which would be incompatible with the deal he just penned to join the EU. So he actually accepts Putin's offer, and that then leads to this so-called revolution of dignity, the Maidan protests. You see them here on the Maidan Square, which is the main square of Kiev. And ultimately, there's a disaster. Force is used. Security forces fire on the protesters. It's a disaster. And Yanukovych ultimately flees to Moscow. There's a huge crisis of governance. And ultimately, the Ukrainian parliament, in the absence of all the pro-Russian parties, essentially create a new government. And that government is completely pro-Western. That government decides to make an irrevocable choice towards the EU, towards NATO. In response to this, Russia freaks out. Russia decides that it is, actually, this is the wrong order. Let me do this slide first. Russia decides that this is inconsistent with Russia's definition of its national interest, and Russia intervenes. The first move Russia makes is a really bold so-called hybrid move of sending in highly trained special forces known as polite green men in Russian, highly professional, missing one thing, namely insignia. so that he could try to claim that he wasn't really doing what he was actually doing, which was using a military contingent to create a regime change in the province of Ukraine, Crimea, this peninsula you see on the right, and create a secessionist government there under Russian auspices that is ultimately, in a rapidly and ramshackle organized a referendum, decides it wants to join Russia, and Russia annexes Crimea. This absolutely freaks out the West. This is, in their view, the first time you've seen an annexation, a border change in Europe in so many generations. It's totally unacceptable. And that's the origins of the beginning of the sanctions regime that has been on Russia ever since. After that, when this didn't produce the outcome that Russia wanted, which was somehow to destabilize that government in Kiev and make it come back into the Russian fold, we get this phenomenon, which is so-called volunteers like this guy on the right, guy named Igor, calls himself Igor Strelkov. This is a poster saying, these are warriors of steel, join the army of Strelkov. And these Russian so-called volunteers, which we now know were supported by Russia, actually went in and fomented and assisted a rebellion in these eastern provinces to try to, again, to pressure Ukraine. To say to Ukraine, if you don't do what we want, we've got this dagger in you, and we can twist this dagger whenever we want. And the result of this intervention in the so-called the Donbass region, the Donetsk Cold Basin region in Luhansk and Donetsk, was a stalemate. Not after a fairly devastating civil war, killing some 15,000 soldiers, but creating over 1 million refugees and imposing very intense costs on both sides, but mainly on Ukraine. So that is the situation that we are talking about when we talk about a settlement of the Ukrainian situation. This Minsk process you see referred to is an attempt to settle the twin claims of the Ukrainians wanting the Russians out of their country and wanting to reclaim the territory, and the Russians claiming that the Ukrainians are threatening the Russian-speaking or pro-Russian or Russian world type residents of that territory, and that they need defense by Russia. So that then brings us to the current crisis. And I'm going to close here. How am I doing on time? I'm at 25 minutes by my PowerPoint. PowerPoint doesn't lie, so I'm doing pretty well here. And let me just bring us back to the present. So I've given you what the crisis sort of is. I've given you the background of at least 3 of the key pieces of the crisis, sort of Ukraine's stance between Russia and the West, the European security order and contestation over it with an increasingly powerful and dissatisfied Russia, and that series of events that led to the crisis in Ukraine and the Russian intervention. So now we're back to where we started. Russia has deployed some 80 battalion tactical groups around Ukraine. Biden says it's 150,000 troops. And the first question, let's just ask 2 questions. Why now? And then, is a peaceful settlement, what's the likelihood of, what would need to happen for a peaceful settlement? How likely do we think it is? So why now? Why this move now? Nobody knows for sure. Here's where I have to do the caveat that all experts make, which is that key foreign policy and national security decisions in Russia are made by Vladimir Putin and Vladimir Putin alone. So you can read what their foreign minister says, you can read what their defense minister says, you can hear speeches given by their parliamentarians. That's all quite interesting, but it's not telling you who the key decider, what the key decider is thinking. So everything I'm about to say is inference. I have a lot of contacts in Russia and hang out with them. I read voraciously, but here's the general story about why we are seeing this heightened tension around Ukraine and this increased effort of Russia to translate its local military superiority into some progress on the political objectives it seeks that I mentioned above at the beginning of the talk. First thing to bear in mind about why now is Russia's policy up to now hasn't worked. Since 2014, you've had a stalemate. You've got Crimea, so that, according to Russia, is awesome. We've returned, as their view, Crimea to the Russian fold. But the subsequent intervention in the Donbass didn't really generate the results that Russia wanted. On the contrary, it pushed Ukraine more and more towards the West. solidifying a more pro-Western identity across the Ukraine, and not just in the previous Western sections, but throughout the center of the country to some degree, as best as we can measure. And it's just not generating any movement. And Russia's effort to make progress on its objectives through non-military means have not panned out. They've tried economic pressure and economic benefits. They've tried offering Ukraine blandishments and benefits of various kinds, also punishing Ukraine. They've tried hybrid operations. They've tried cyber attacks on Ukraine to weaken it and force it to be unstable or somehow to come to terms. They've used domestic influence operations, various agents and oligarchs they have under their control. They've attempted to negotiate with the West. Putin keeps saying, I keep wanting to negotiate these issues with the West. The West doesn't pay any attention. So Moscow's view here is that for 8 years, there's been essentially stalemate and a failure of non-military means to produce any progress. Hence, the argument goes, we should use the one other lever of influence that we have, military power. It's important to recognize here, just a very quick interjection, that Russia's experience of the use of military power is, over the last decade or so, is exactly the opposite of the American experience. The American experience is it's futile, it's devastating, it's forever wars. The Russian experience is it works. They crushed the insurgency in the breakaway province of Chechnya. They successfully intervened in Georgia to keep it out of NATO. They successfully intervened in Syria to support their ally Bashar al-Assad, who's still in power today. They successfully intervened in Ukraine, brought back beautiful Crimea into the Russian fold. It's just a string of instances in which military coercion has worked for Russia. And so the argument goes, they're probably feeling their oats a bit on the utility of this particular tool of statecraft. The other factor why now is that the president of Ukraine, a former comedic actor, Volodymyr Zelensky, was elected and won a landslide on the promise of better relations with Russia. And so Russia was hopeful. Hey, here's a guy who's a native Russian speaker. We can negotiate with him. He's awesome. But unfortunately, from the Russian perspective, Zelensky actually reneged on his campaign promises and took an ever-increasing, what Russia would say, anti-Russian and pro-West line. And he started to move decisively against Russia's main levers of influence in Ukraine, these key oligarchs, highly connected business people who are beholden to or favorable towards Moscow. So they're essentially seeing a situation now that's not only not progressing, it seems from the Russian perspective to be regressing, to be declining, to be getting worse. There was an assessment, moreover, which I'd be happy to discuss, that Russia is actually in a pretty strong position to make a move now, try to force the issue now. The Biden administration has expressed a desire to have practical, predictable relations with Russia. Seems like Biden is interested in stabilizing the situation with Russia. That might give us leverage. Biden says he wants to focus on China. That means he's going to need to be nice to us because the last thing he wants is a Europe creating a lot of problems. The relationship with China is awesome. We love Xi Jinping. He's going to help us if we get into any trouble. So he has our back. We have this giant superpower in Beijing on our side. And and Russia seems thought well prepared. Its military has been modernized. It has a huge sovereign wealth fund, $660 billion it's got stashed away in case it has to face sanctions. So it seemed like now the argument goes, we don't know for sure because we're not sitting in the Kremlin listening to Putin's innermost thoughts. It seemed like now is a good time to move. So that's a kind of explaining why now, after 8 years, Russia felt like it was the time to change the dynamic and to upset the status quo in its favor. All right, I've been talking fast. You've been looking at a screen. I'm going to stop the share now to talk about the current situation, the prospects for a peaceful resolution. This is a very tough question. We are dealing in a world of uncertainty. Nonetheless, you have to put forward what you think might happen. How do we get out of this situation to a peaceful resolution? How do we avoid war? War that everybody wants to avoid. I even believe the Russians would prefer this situation to be resolved somehow without war. If war occurs, the costs are horrific for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe, for us. It's bad for everybody. We want to avoid this if at all possible. But to get that peaceful outcome requires concessions from all sides. Russia can't expect, and we know despite the fact that they published these treaties, they can't possibly expect to get absolutely everything they asked for. The West, however, also, I think, would have to give something. It can't just be all take. It can't be a complete humiliating step down by Putin without any gains. So it's possible that we can imagine a deal. This is what we pay diplomats for. They're skilled at this. You can imagine a kind of deal that sort of fudges the issue and tries to make each side sort of kind of able to declare victory. Some pledge about NATO expansion to Ukraine that would not say that it's forever, ever, but would also somehow reassure the Russians that it's not happening kind of in the policy relevant future. I mean, this is what diplomacy does. It tries to find language to let two people walk away from a table thinking that they've got what they wanted. Ukraine to agree possibly to some kind of autonomy for that rebellious Donbass republic. It's tough because it's very difficult to accept that you've allowed a foreign power to step into your country and support an insurgency and then negotiate with these people. So that's a really tough one, but that's something along those lines, some promise that something is going to happen to sort of take that card off the table. And the West would perhaps not accept the treaties that Russia put on the table, but engage Russia on arms control in Central Europe in a way that would seem to be and legitimately be trying to address Putin's concerns about a deal. So about European security. So one can imagine a deal like that happening. People are seeing some signs today. Russia claims to be de-escalating and moving forces away from Ukraine. All the experts on the ground are saying this is not actually happening. We see references to possible diplomatic deals. There's a parade of leaders going to Moscow. German Chancellor just there yesterday. There could be a deal like this sort of that's not being talked about, that's behind the scenes that could lead to a settlement. I'm unfortunately, and against my wishes and hopes, I'm rather skeptical even now that this could happen. I'm very skeptical that Putin will accept a fudge that doesn't win him many of his demands, because I think that he assesses the balance of power to be in his favor. And I think he sees big cost to backing down in the face of Western pressure, in the face of Western threats of sanctions. If he backs down in the face of these threats, everybody in the West is going to say that he was bluffing and that he backed down, and all we need to do with Putin is take a tough line. I think that's something he's not going to want to accept. There's possible domestic ramifications of backing down humiliatingly without achieving much. I don't know if he is going to, if that's a big consideration for him, given how dominant he is in domestic politics. The key thing here is it's hard. So given that, I think, frankly, my assessment is the West has to give more in the way of concessions than Putin to make a deal. And the reason is I think Russia is more powerful in Ukraine in terms of military power, and Russia is more resolved. It cares more about the issue than the West does. It's hard for the West, however, to give that much. For one thing, Ukrainian politics. If Zelensky caves on some of these issues, the next day he's out of office and we have a much more virulent nationalist grouping in power. At least, I might be exaggerating somewhat, but there are huge political costs and risks to Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, if he agrees to some of these deals that the Russians want. So he, in some sense, in the current moment, can't make some of these concessions. And the US and its allies have already said they're very reluctant to move on some of these demands that Russia has made. They've just stated categorically that they're not going to do it. So I'm skeptical about a peaceful solution, although every day I look at every straw in the wind, every possible saving grace, and I grasp at it and I hope for it. And I see a few of them out there. The Ukrainian ambassador to the UK floated the idea of maybe Ukraine itself will withdraw its request for NATO. I don't know if anything's going to come of that. He's an ambassador. He probably didn't say that without authorization, but it's an easily deniable thing. Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, has made reference to an ongoing diplomatic process. There is this initial claim that Russia claims it's de-escalating. So who knows? One can be hopeful that there might be a deal in the background. Final comment I'll make, though, is where are we in the state of play? Is there an urgency? Many of you will have read that U.S. intelligence agencies claim to be expecting an invasion very, very soon. But there's a debate over that, with many people, both in Moscow and in Kiev, saying that Russia can keep this pressure up for a long time, and that there isn't this window of use it or lose it regarding this military force. So you might be able to see a longer game by Putin, where he's kind of modulating the pressure up and modulating the pressure down. Olive branch, sword, in the hopes of maybe extracting a better deal from this, or maybe destabilizing the government in Kiev. That's why you see Zelensky pushing back against American claims that the invasion by Russia was imminent. The United States had its reasons for these disclosures of intelligence, trying to put Russia on the back foot, make it harder for Russia to find an excuse to go to war. But you can see that it has this perverse effect of potentially destabilizing Ukraine, Zelensky pushing back hard against that. Each side is maneuvering to make the other look like the aggressor. Each wants to seem reasonable in terms of diplomacy, and at the same time not give away too much in terms of the concession. That's the equilibrium we're in right now. I personally can't resolve the debate over how long Russia can sustain this posture. I personally think it can't sustain it for too long without essentially leading to a potential conclusion that he was all bluff to begin with and lose that leverage that he now has over the crisis. So with that, I will conclude at, gosh, I've gone over time, beg your pardon, and at 40 minutes instead of 30, 35. Oh, well, did my best. But anyway, looking forward for the Q&A.
Thank you very, very, very much, Professor Wohlforth. That was complete. Exactly, that was complete and unnerving, but sometimes hopeful. So I'm sure that our attendees have lots of questions to ask you. And I just want to remind everybody to please click the chat button, type in a question and send it on to us, and we'll make sure it gets asked. But first, I'm going to be inviting our hostess tonight, Mary McMahon, to ask the first question.
You pretty much answered this, but I want to push you a little bit further, given how comprehensively you understand the situation. Can you imagine a scenario where Ukraine gives up its dream of joining NATO and allows Russia to take full control of the East, where it already has a lot of control? NATO promises not to encroach any further east, offers Ukraine as a buffer state. Can you imagine such a scenario that would make it face-saving for Putin to back down and to de-escalate, seriously de-escalate all of this military and naval power around Ukraine?
I think that that would amount, essentially what you were describing, that would amount to pretty much a capitulation on the part of Ukraine, so that everything that the current government of Ukraine says that it is absolutely unmovable on, it would have to move on. I think if it did all the things that you mentioned, that would be seen as a huge win for Putin. I think the kind of ideal outcome, at least I think an outcome that would certainly be met with approval in the Russian corridors of power, would be a formal neutralization agreement of Ukraine, where both the Ukrainian authorities, but also the West, the NATO and Russia all essentially agree that Ukraine will remain a neutral state, not join a Russian alliance and not join a Western alliance. That right now would be politically toxic in Ukraine. Thanks in part to Russia's own belligerent behavior, the feelings of national identity and pro-West sentiment in Ukraine are very, very strong. It would take a lot of changes on the ground, a lot of political changes, a lot of tectonic shifts before a Ukrainian government could do the things that you spelled out. But the specific answer to the question is, do I think such a program of concessions or responses would satisfy or meet with the Russian expectations or hopes for the crisis? And I think the answer is yes. By the way, just as a quick interjection, in my entire talk, I never mentioned the status of Crimea. I find it, and almost everybody who studies Russia finds it absolutely inconceivable that Crimea is ever going back to Ukraine. And so essentially, any settlement would have an agree to disagree kind of settlement with Crimea. We in the West would never agree to recognize Russia's annexation, but we would not hold Russia to an intense sanctions regime or make it a pariah for continuing that, much as we dealt with the Soviet occupation of the Baltic states during the Cold War. Very few people would expect we could get more than that out of Russia with its Crimean annexation.
Thank you.
Now we have a question from a member of our audience, a man named Alan. I don't have a last name. Isn't this equivalent to the Cuban Missile Crisis? The Russians are no happier having NATO on its border as the US was to have the Soviet Union on its border.
Yes, I mean, that is the way the Russians view it, and there's a serious side to it, which is that Cuba, of course, you can get into the fact that Cuba was a dictatorship, wasn't democratic when it made its decisions, whereas Ukraine is democratic. And so if one considers the type of regime of the country over which people are arguing to matter, then the American diplomats here would say that that's a distinction, is a very important distinction. However, that set aside, the Cuban government wanted to have a treaty alliance with the Soviet Union, and as part of that, perfectly legally under international law, it requested of the Soviet Union defense weapons that it considered to be defensive, and the Soviet Union supplied those weapons. The United States was willing to risk nuclear war to prevent that from happening. Now, in this crisis, we do not have any such American Ukrainian request for or American offer to deploy on Ukrainian territory any nuclear missiles at all. And in fact, we tell the Russians we've been very, very careful that the kinds of weaponry with which we supply the Ukrainians is really sort of not a significant threat to Russia. It's really, it truly does seem to be defensive weaponry. But Putin responds, well, that's what you're saying now. But how do I know in the future, once it's integrated in NATO, once this becomes a fact on the ground, I will have no leverage with which to compete if you suddenly should decide that you want to put offensive missiles in Ukraine. So there are important differences, but the Russians really bridle at this idea that we reject spheres of influence when we kind of don't fully accept that. We kind of believe there is a sphere of influence in America that gives the United States the right, in some sense, to combat the influence of potentially hostile powers' actions in this hemisphere. And Russia claims that that's no different than what they're trying to do in Ukraine. So there are some parallels between the two crises.
Thank you. Next, we're going to have a question from on camera from Pauline Barnes.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask.
Wait a minute, start my video.
Okay.
Can you
All
see
right,
Pauline?
going ahead.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask, even if this crisis is resolved peacefully, do you see this as a kind of blueprint for Russian brinkmanship elsewhere in Europe? And I'm thinking specifically of Kaliningrad and the Suwalki Gap, that bit of landmass that runs between Poland and Lithuania. Would that prove a tempting target, do you think?
Well, Kaliningrad is Russian territory, but you're mentioning that puts Russian military capabilities, on the other side and into kind of EU and NATO territory, and gives Russia military options with respect to Poland and the Baltic states that it wouldn't have if it didn't possess that sort of exclave, as it's called, I think the predominance or the majority of people who try to study Russian foreign relations do not expect Russia to cross the line to a military coercive attack on a member of NATO. The risks of that to Russia would really seem to be overwhelming given Russia's interest. So most people think that the Russian national security establishment, including Putin, in some sense, respect this Article 5 guarantee that's written in the NATO treaty that even though they have absolute military superiority over the Baltic states, they could crush those states in a day. There's no way they could defend themselves against Russia. There's very few people really expect that to happen. There are some, particularly in Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, who think it could happen. And they are legitimately concerned living next to this gigantic and belligerent and militarily powerful country. But I think the probability of that happening is pretty low. But your question though is were they to succeed in Ukraine? And were its coercive efforts to succeed in Ukraine? Would that so bolden Putin as to make his appetite grow for yet more? Again, I think the answer is probably not. I think that unless they have a very clever plan for how they're going to do their operation in Ukraine, if they do it, if it's truly a significant land operation, I think you will see some very powerful counter responses from the West. Now, Russia says it can survive these things and that whatever we're going to do to it in terms of sanctions, and then ultimately it can prevail. But I think the costs will be really, really large. And so having suffered those costs, it seems to me highly unlikely that Russia would be eager for another attempt at another NATO member. And finally, here really it is worthwhile to point back to that very, very first slide. In the Russian viewpoint, both for strategic, but also for nationalistic and cultural and all kinds of other reasons, Ukraine is different. The feelings that Russians have and the sense that they have of Ukraine somehow being close to them and a threat to them if it's hostile, but it just can't be compared with how they feel about Poland or how they feel about the Baltic states. And so for all those reasons, I don't think the interest or the incentive would be as great. So if you add all of that up, I think I personally am not all that worried by that threat, which is why if you're asking from my own position, given what I told you above about what I think the balance of power is and the balance of interest in, I would be urging upon Western leaders an effort to lean as far over your skis as you can, an effort to make as many concessions as is conceivable. I don't expect them to give Russia everything that it wants, but working towards this sort of de facto neutralization of Ukraine, as painful as it is to say, I think is a reasonable response. And I don't think it risks so emboldening Putin that we would simply have more trouble down the road. Final thing I'll say on this as to why I think it's the Western interest to try to settle this crisis without war is Biden was right when he came into office. And Jake Sullivan and Anthony Blinken and the rest of them, that we need to focus on China. And, Russia has this capacity to get itself on our agenda. They were right to try to seek a stable relationship with Russia. This country, the United States, may not be able to afford containing two major powers in two different regions at the same time. So at some point, either we're going to have to kind of pull back from Asia or somehow deal with that, or we're going to have to settle this European thing. And so we need to be willing, or at least have to consider the possibility of making really difficult and really unpleasant concessions that I would prefer that we not have to make.
That was interesting. Okay, we have another question now from Tim Butterworth, a former state representative from here in New Hampshire. He's asking, could you talk about corruption and oligarchs? Increasing inequity in the United States has weakened our strength and unity. Is it having any impact in Russia?
I think it is. I think, frankly, in both countries concerned here, the problem of corruption in the politics and economics of these countries is a crucial and weakening factor. In Ukraine, it's just an endemic and horrible problem. And we saw how it kind of played into our domestic politics during the Trump years and the first impeachment of Trump. The Ukraine economy is dominated by these oligarchs. These oligarchs don't always have the best interests of the country at heart. Ukraine has not developed very well. Its per capita GDP is less than half that of Russia. From a perspective of someone living in Ukraine, if you go to Russia, you're going from a pretty poor country to a quite wealthy seeming country. It's important to recognize there's a huge material difference between these countries. For Russia, its corrupt, oligarchical, kleptocratic system centered around the personage of Putin is working. It sort of functions, but it's preventing Russia from really modernizing. And so I do think it weakens Russia. Russia could be a much more dynamic. It's got a very talented population. It's got very well-educated and smart technocrats, engineers, entrepreneurs. If this country weren't so corrupt, it didn't have that stultifying bureaucracy over everything, which is deeply corrupt. Just think of what innovative things Russia could be up to that it's not up to today. Its reliance on its natural resource and raw material exports still an important kind of ball and chain around that economy. All the young Russians that I know, I spent years sort of interacting with as part of a research grant I worked on with Moscow State Institute of International Relations. They're all pretty supportive of Putin's foreign policy. It's important to recognize. They don't want war in Ukraine, but they're pretty supportive of the foreign policy. They are very, very critical of this domestic oligarch-ridden, inefficient, state-heavy, natural resource-dependent economy that's ended up to be Putin's legacy.
Thank you. Next, we have a question from an audience member. She's going to be on camera, Joey Andros. Joey, are you there? Joey, there you are.
So the question I was going to ask, I'm not going to ask, but I'm going to ask a question related to something I heard on the radio today about what's already happening there. Not even though the troops haven't gone in, and they're flexing their tanks muscle all around, but there's cyber attacks going on constantly, which are making it, things can be shut down. Banks could be, interfere with. So I was just wondering, is there any end to this? I mean, it just seems like this has been going on among a number of countries. And then, if they really, they've kind of gotten people's attention with the tanks, but there's stuff going on in other ways.
Yes, there was a cyber attack. The hackers, presumably based in Russia, haven't heard that confirmed, but the Ukrainians say the Russian-based hackers have attacked a couple of major banks in Ukraine. There was a period in which people couldn't access their accounts. I think that's been fixed. They did a denial of service attack on the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. I think that was repaired. And Ukraine has been suffering cyber attacks ever since 2014, including one of the worst cyber attacks. I think it's been said to be the most expensive in history in terms of the cost. They're called NotPetya attack, which was a pseudo ransomware attack. It wasn't really ransomware where you try to get money in Bitcoin and you'll release the codes, the malicious code. In this case, it pretended to be one, but actually it was just meant to shut down Ukraine. And the problem was that had ramified effects throughout a lot of global multinational corporations and ended up costing billions. And they tried shutting down the power grid. They intervened in an election where they tried to get false, they tried to have an announcer say false result. It's just relentless. However, the point that I tried to make in the talk was that with all of that harassment, they haven't made any progress towards their political goal of preventing Ukraine's drift to the West. And so kind of like all of this talk that somehow there's some other form of warfare that's going to replace big metal things that go boom, at least in this case, that talk has proven not to be the case, and that Russia can't seem to get its object without threatening a good old-fashioned invasion. And so that's telling you something. Now, there's a final point I'll make on this, though, which is that a lot of the cyber, this is getting into a slightly different subject, but a lot of the cyber capacity is never tested. It's held in reserve for whenever a war actually happens. So what Russia can actually do to Ukraine and what the US could do to Russia and vice versa in the extreme situation where they're actually fighting is not known. In other words, cyber to get big results may have to accompany traditional war rather than replace traditional war. And so far, that's what we're seeing in the Russia-Ukraine case.
Next, we have Andrew Wilking, who is going to be asking you a question on camera as well.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you for your presentation, Professor. I also have changed my questions somewhat. So Russia agreed to the Alma-Ata Declaration of '91, to the Budapest Memorandum of '94, the Founding Act with NATO of '97. And yet it had invaded Crimea in 2014 and has already made inroads in Ukraine in the Donbas region. It seems to me this is very similar to what Hitler did in the second half of the 1930s. And Britain and France continued to put up with it, if you will, until war came. And now NATO and the United States, it seems to me, are putting up with what Mr. Putin is doing. It seems to me that there are strong comparisons between the two. And why should we not put down the glove and say no more? At this point, Russia is not a first-rate military power. We should call their bluff, don't you think?
We can't defend Ukraine from Russia. That's not possible. We don't have the forces of Europe with 2 or 3 years. And if we were to raise taxes and spend a couple $100 billion and get the ship transport, get the, we're down to, after the end of the Cold War, we really reduced our forces in Europe. So we don't really have an ability to defend Ukraine from Russia. That's just the unanimous opinion of military experts, including in Ukraine, in Russia, and in the United States and in Europe. So one of the things about politics is it's the art of the possible. And if you can't defend Ukraine, you can't defend Ukraine. So you got to find some other way of deterring Russia, which is what I think the Biden administration is trying to do, trying to round up a posse to say that, man, if you do this, the costs are going to be so devastating to Russia that you're not going to want to do it. The Ukrainians are trying to do a kind of deterrence by saying, if you invade, we're going to do an insurgency against you, and we're going to make it costly for you, and we're going to make you bleed. And the Americans, at least some of them, have even said, we've been fighting forever wars. We've been fighting counterinsurgencies for a long time, and we've learned a lot about insurgency. If you invade Ukraine, we're going to aid whatever insurgency develops there. So it's a kind of different kind of deterrence than this idea of drawing a line on the border between Ukraine and Russia and saying, we're going to stop your forces from getting across. So their military should not be underestimated. Certainly, it's no match. It's sort of head to head to the United States, but that's not what we're talking about here. We can't really get our main stuff into that theater, and so that's basically my answer to that. Is you kind of have to you have to deal with the actual balance of power. But aside from that, with the Hitler analogy, I get great. Putin is a revisionist actor. That is to say, he wants to change the status quo, just like Hitler did. And he has been saying this, since, as I said, since 2007. Russia has never been satisfied with a US-dominated European security order that threatens to expand into Ukraine. They've said it over and over and over again. However, I don't think he has the kind of ideology of expansion and murderous racism. It's an unpleasant ideology. I don't like Russian nationalism. I don't like Putinism. But I wouldn't equate it with Nazism. It's not quite there in terms of how horrific it is, exterminating people based on their heritage. So he doesn't have that. He has a kind of authoritarianism, sort of weird, not weird, it's kind of Russian nationalist authoritarianism is better than democracy. You guys are too progressive, LGBTQ, we're traditional. You know, he's got this weird set of kind of, I think, very ad hoc and instrumental kind of arguments that what Russia stands for, but it's not that kind of really push forth and conquer kind of ideology that you saw in Hitler. So I would agree with you that he's a revisionist and that we have not really pushed back that hard. I totally agree with that. But I wouldn't quite go all the way to the Munich analogy here in terms of what would happen if we were to make some kind of deal with him, that he would immediately go on the warpath and start conquering more countries.
This is an interesting one from France Menk. For further understanding of Putin's psychology, could you comment on the development of his mindset from his days with the KGB?
Well, there's some really great books on that. And so it's a really big and interesting subject. It is a personalistic regime built around the person of Vladimir Putin. So it's legitimate to ask what we know about this person. Fiona Hill, who was a national security official for Russia under the Trump administration and famously was involved in the impeachment hearings on the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Fiona Hill wrote probably what still stands as the best book on Putin. And it essentially has, you know, a kind of a set of themes that run through his personality. One of them is the KGB operatives, this idea that the country's always under threat, that you need to control information, kind of that Putin. And then there's the Putin, the kind of like husbander of resources, the Putin who runs Russia on a very tight, fiscally conservative strategy to be prepared for anything. That's why he balances budgets. That's why he has surpluses in his foreign exchange. That's why he has a gigantic sovereign wealth fund. That's why he does all this sort of protective stuff. And so if you try to put together these various Putins, you get what she describes as a very calculating, careful, but suspicious leader. The final piece of the three, so there's the KGB agent, there's the sort of husbander of resources, that person who's saving for the, you know, protecting for the rainy day, and finally the statist. So he really seems to believe in the importance of the Russian state, this gargantuan state apparatus as the only defender of Russia from a world that is out to plunder it, to make it weak, to split it up. And so if you put weave these three pieces together, you kind of get a picture of this person that I think is fairly accurate. And I can conclude, if she's right, then, you know, it's just possible that he might be bluffing. In other words, it might be, I mean, I don't think he is, but he might be, because everything he's done so far has been very incremental. It may seem really bold, and it was bold, but it was small, measured uses of military force. In Georgia, 2008, in the Crimean annexation, first hybrid, denied it, then accepted responsibility for it. Very moderated support of the Donbass rebellion. Syria operation, very limited, just an air content. I mean, each thing has been really kind of reversible, controlled. To go from those things to 150,000 strong troop invasion of a country the size of France, 50 million population is a big leap. So if you buy that sort of careful calculating story about Putin, you will maybe think that he can be talked down from what we think of as a reckless use of force in this case.
That's wonderful. Next, we are going to hear from Lynn Reed, who's going to be on camera.
Yeah. Professor, this is a little bit off the subject, but not really, I don't think. Could you talk about the role that Turkey, a current member of NATO, might play strategically, especially with the expiration in 2023 of the 1923 Lausanne Treaty and its economic implications. Are these two former empires, both with autocratic leaders, going to change the geopolitical balance in the region in the longer term?
I don't think so, and but it's very hard to read. So President Erdogan is playing a very interesting role and game here. He has had what people sometimes refer to as a bromance with Putin. He has tried to really have his cake and eat it too, as being a NATO member, but also having a close relationship with Putin. He has purchased the S-400 defenses. And one of the reasons in response to the previous question is Russia has an incredibly good air defense. I mean, it's really serious, and not sure how we would fare against it. We could probably handle it. I don't know. But at any rate, S-400, which made us, the NATO allies, refuse to complete the F-35 deal. Long story. Bottom line, though, is it's so complicated. If you look at the Syria situation, they're on different sides of that one. If you look at the Armenia and Azerbaijan war, different sides on that one. Turkey really got involved in increasing Azerbaijan's power. And if you look in this one, you got Turkey selling drones to Ukraine that are probably the weapon so far that has had the greatest assistance and might conceivably impose the greater costs on Russia should it decide to invade. So Erdogan is playing he likes an ambiguous stance between the two. He thinks that gives him the most leverage. I think there's structural limits on how far he can go in a sort of a collaborative relationship with Putin.
Okay, good. Thank you.
We have a question here from Marilyn. And she's wondering, would more extreme financial sanctions on Russians' oligarchs have any effect on Putin's aggression?
We've tried these targeted sanctions against oligarchs. They really haven't done that much. This is a very big. They have done nothing to restrain. Clearly, as we can see before our eyes today, they've done nothing to restrain. They've done very little to restrain Russia. They've endured some costs. So some of these oligarchs have had to, lose some assets or lose access to assets or have a kind of life that's a little bit slightly constrained, places they can't go for fear of being seized, and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, these targeted sanctions against oligarchs close to Putin have not been successful. And indeed, our sanctions against Russia overall have not been successful. In fact, Putin has said he really appreciates these sanctions because they've enabled him to kind of build up his domestic economy. He did reverse sanctions against the EU, and EU put sanctions on Russia. He responded with sanctions on European agricultural exports, which really boosted the Russian agriculture to its best position since the Bolshevik Revolution. So the targeted sanctions are on oligarchs. But yeah, there are some things that could be done. We constantly hear about, they're parking all of this money in London in real estate. Can't the UK authorities, clamp down on all these beautiful Kensington zillion-pound houses that these oligarchs own? UK has its own laws. I don't know exactly how it would do that. Maybe it could do that. But I think the sanctions that are now being talked about are the type of sanctions that would really have a big effect. So the United States is talking about sanctioning the top Russian banks. So this would essentially close off the ability of Russia to do business with lots of the economy. Now, lots of the global economy. Now, China would step in and help them. The Americans are also talking about using secondary sanctions to essentially prevent the import to Russia of critical components, and namely semiconductors. And that would really shut down chunks of the modern Russian economy. And if we did that, then Russia's going to come back at us. And they have a lot of tools they can use to come back at us. And I sort of hope we don't see where that one goes, because Russia itself, Russia supplies, it's a big exporter of oil to the United States. It's obviously a big exporter of gas to Europe. It's actually a key source of neon, which is used for the construction of semiconductors, which if we're to shut that down in response to whole set, you think you have supply chain problems now, blah, blah, blah. I could go on and on and on. So who wins that war is a really tough one to say. I like to think that the American economy is so strong and so central to the global economy that we would ultimately sort of impose a lot more cost on Russia than they can impose on us. But it's a tough one, because as I said, that one strand of Putin that Fiona's book talks about is about preparing for exactly this, to prevent Russia from being in a situation. He spent all of his time in power, partly trying to insulate Russia from exactly that kind of pressure. So I'm not sure where it would actually end up.
Thank you. Next, we're going to be hearing from our own Ambassador Adrian Bassora, who has a question for you.
Okay, thank you so much for all the ground you've covered, Professor Wohlforth. Let me just ask you a very general question. That is, what is your assessment of what the way the Biden administration has handled Putin's extreme provocations or confrontational tactics thus far? And if you were his advisor right now, what would you advise him? Are there things that you would advise him to do differently, retrospectively or going forward?
My main response is to applaud and be quite positive about the Biden administration's handling of this tough crisis after the disaster in Afghanistan, with by any account a really sort of devastatingly bad handling of that one. In this crisis, they seem to be handling things better. There's a lot of debate about some of the things they've done, which we can talk about. But at the end of the day, I would support many of the things they've done. Number one, they are playing this information game full with everything they've got, which means they need to be as forthcoming as they can diplomatically. They need to send their top people over to negotiate. They need to be like, they cannot have history say, we didn't try hard to negotiate. And so that's the only point of criticism I have, is I, as an academic, not facing any political constraints, would say, I think you should be even more forward leaning with thinking about things that you could say about the potential for Ukraine to be a member. Because the thing that bothers people like me is Ukraine's not going to be a member of NATO. It's not happening.
That's
in part
right.
because it's a consensus alliance, and we have members of the alliance who have always said ever since the beginning that they're not in favor of this. So it's not happening. So a guy can be excused for saying this is ridiculous to risk war over a principle when you know you're never going to do it. Like, now they have important political, diplomatic, and strategic reasons for this open door policy thing. But if I were in the government, I would see how I would be pushing for more forward leaning on that particular issue. The other stuff they've done is very interesting. It's very controversial, but they're releasing intelligence on possible Russian planning in order, in some sense, to put Russia on the back foot, to make it harder for Russia, for example, to come up with what diplomats like you would call a casus belli, namely a legitimate reason for war, because the Russians conceivably, according to the US government, we can debate, we don't know, we're not seeing the actual intelligence. The Russians are thinking about various provocations that they could use to put the blame on the Ukrainians. It's kind of funny if you think about what the Russians are trying to do. You invade a country and take a piece of it. Then you surround the country with 150,000 troops. And then you say, if that country tries to move towards the part of the country that you've already invaded, that's a threat to you and you're going to invade them. And that's essentially what they're saying. Indeed, Putin today, after Olaf Scholz was there, basically Putin said, accused the Ukrainians of plotting a genocide against the Russian and Russian-speaking population in Donbass. I mean, it's absurd. But the Biden administration is trying to preempt that through its own form of information warfare, which is to expose these things before Putin does them or thinks about them, making it harder for him. It's conceivable that the reason you're now hearing talk from Moscow about de-escalation and further talks is because these information operations by the United States have sort of put them on the back foot, and he needs to regain the initiative. So, and finally, the Biden administration has worked assiduously, and this is even their harshest critics have to admit, they work well with the alliance. They are working hard to bring people together. The one little, so they're working hard to sort of bring the alliance together. Putin's making it easier for them to do it, but they are doing that. So on all of those counts, I would give them very, very high marks in a very tough situation. If you watch those briefings by Jake Sullivan, or you watch those briefings by Anthony Blinken, they're a masterpiece. I mean, you try doing that. You try standing in front of those reporters and not making a misstep. I mean, I got to tell you, I'm not going to get partisan here, but after what we had with President Trump's administration when it came to these kinds of briefings, it's really nice to see very highly competent people in there. So on all of these areas, I would say, objectively, you know, my view, it's not my normative view, is that they've done a pretty good job.
I agree with you, and I thank you very much for your superb presentation.
Okay, next we have a question from David Howell in our audience. Is there any chance that Putin could lose this endeavor? And what would be the consequence of this loss of face?
This is the huge debate. What would happen if he stands down, if Russia stands down and gains almost nothing? You know, obviously, and there's a question here in the chat about this, like, what do Russian people know? Now, of course, or how much do they know? Of course, the Russian information space is dominated by state media, which will try to spin anything as a grand victory for Putin. I mean, they could say, look, you know, they could try to claim all kinds of victories. They could say, for example, look, we threatened Ukraine, and the Americans said 1,000 times over that they're not going to send any troops there. Personally, I believe that was a very good move by Biden to say that clearly, because that's trying to de-escalate the situation. You don't want a lot of Americans in there if Russia did invade, because that could draw us into that conflict, and it's not one we want to be drawn into. However, saying that might be spun in the domestic Russian context as, look what our president did. It basically proved that, you know, there's no way NATO is ever going to defend Ukraine. So it's possible that he could back down and try to claim various things like, look, we've got this high level discussion. Look, we've dominated the political discussion. Look, everybody respects us again, without actually gaining anything on these key objectives that they put forth. That's possible. I personally think it's unlikely that he will settle for that. I just find that hard to believe, because I do think there was to be some costs for him down the road. I don't think there'd be big domestic costs, but I think there'd be external costs, in that the West is going to conclude from this, he's completely unresolved. He's not going to do this, which means we can continue integrating Ukraine into NATO. We continue expanding NATO. I mean, why would we not? Why would we not? We've been doing it. Why would we not continue doing it if he backs down? So I think there's some strategic cost to Putin if he doesn't get something out of this crisis more than just simply the spin that I referred to before. I don't see him under a domestic threat. Man, I mean, it's sad. I've been traveling to Russia since the Soviet Union, since 1984. Of course, nothing going on there now is like the degree of authoritarianism of the Soviet Union, but it's been a steady, relentless increase in authoritarian controls over information, and ruthless crushing of the opposition, including poisoning Alexei Navalny and now holding him under trumped-up charges in jail, who is considered his main domestic threat. So I don't think he's in much of a threat of, like, if he loses this crisis, there'll be a coup in Moscow or anything like that.
I think you're going to be happy to hear that this is going to be the last question. We've taken advantage of your generosity and time too long, so this will be it. This comes from Dennis Markham. Russia and China have recently been highlighting the bonds that tie them. In your opinion, would China have a positive response to an invasion of Ukraine by Russia? Would Putin see an invasion of Ukraine as detrimental to Russia's relationship to China?
This is on everybody's mind. This is a fabulous question. And there's a lot of other great questions in there I wish I had a chance to get to, but don't worry, I'm not going to keep you here past my time. This is a great question. And I think that Russia and China have a very productive strategic partnership. It does not amount to a military alliance. They feel they don't need a military alliance. but they feel that they are currently advantaged by each of them protecting the other's back and facing out towards the United States. Each of them sees the United States as their main threat, challenge, adversary. And so there's a very nice, for that, from their perspective, alignment of interest. Plus, they agree on the idea that democracy promotion, promoting human rights, promoting liberal principles, intervening in authoritarian countries, criticizing authoritarian countries for their governance is an annoyance at best and a threat to them at worst. And they want to suppress that. So they're all for authoritarian governments. They're all for keeping democracies on the back foot. However, there's one point where they don't really perfectly line up. And that's this idea of like invading sovereign countries and taking their territory. China has never accepted the legitimacy of Russia's annexation of Crimea. China has taken a very soft line. Now it has said, you know, these Donbass people need to be cared for, et cetera, but it's taken a very careful line on that. So I think most experts agree that Xi Jinping believes that Putin is right, that he's been mistreated by the West, supports Putin's desire to prevent NATO expansion, and basically agrees with Putin's whole worldview. But that does not necessarily extend to being totally happy if Russia invades Ukraine. I think China sees a lot of downsides to that, not least its own flourishing business ties in Ukraine. It doesn't like the principle of invading other countries, and it would have to absorb some costs because basically it would probably step in to support Russia's financial system against these sanctions. The two have been collaborating to try to reduce the role of the dollar in their international international commerce, and so it would take some costs, and it would do that, but it wouldn't be happy. And so I think Xi Jinping, to the extent that he has any influence over what Putin does, would be urging him to kind of try to extract big gains from this crisis without going all the way to war.
Bravo. Thank you very, very, very much, Professor Wohlforth. We appreciate immensely you being with us and sharing your vast knowledge of this problem that we're facing. And we do want to invite you back, and dinner at Burdick's is included, plus a box of chocolates. So that's incentive, and hopefully it will be in person. So thank you.
I hope so too, and thank all the people on the call, and thank you for inviting me. It was a lot of fun for me, and I hope we managed to connect again, as you say, in person.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And just so that everybody knows, we need you to mark your calendar for Thursday, March 17th. We're going to be joined by Ambassador State Roy, who is going to be coming and talking about China. So the issue that we were just talking about. So it should be fascinating. Thank you all for joining us. There will be a recording of this available. If you know someone who was interested and wasn't able to join us, please have them email us and let us know.